To understand the history of Ukraine, it is necessary to begin long before the founding of Kyivan Rus in 882 AD. The land that would become Ukraine lies at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, a vast expanse of fertile plains and river valleys that have drawn settlers, traders, and conquerors for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows that human presence in the region dates back to the Paleolithic period, around 32,000 BC, when early hunter-gatherer communities occupied sites such as the Mizin and Mezhyrich settlements along the Dnipro River. By the Neolithic period, roughly between 600 and 300 BC, these communities began to form more permanent settlements. One of the earliest known cultures of this era was the Trypillian or Kukytini Trypillian culture, which thrived between 5400 and 2700 BC across modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. The Trypillian people built large, organized settlements with distinct layouts, some housing several thousand inhabitants. They developed advanced pottery, used early forms of agriculture, and maintained trade networks that extended into the Balkans and beyond. Their disappearance around 2700 BC is still debated, with theories pointing to climate shifts, soil exhaustion, or invasions from steppe nomads. After the decline of the Trypillian culture, the steppe zone of Ukraine became a corridor for successive waves of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. From around 2000 to 1000 BC, Indo-European tribes moved through the region, leaving behind burial mounds known as kurgans, which remain visible across southern Ukraine. Among them were the Sumerians, an early Indo-Iranian people recorded by Assyrian sources as inhabiting the northern Black Sea steppe by the 9th century BC. They were skilled horsemen and warriors who often raided the territories of Mesopotamia and Anatolia before being displaced by the Scythians. The Scythians dominated the Pontic steppe from roughly the 7th century BC to the 3rd century BC. Described by Herodotus in the 5th century BC, they were a confederation of tribes known for their mastery of mounted warfare, archery, and metalwork. The Scythians maintained complex trade relations with the Greek colonies that began appearing along the Black Sea coast around the 7th century BC. These colonies, such as Olbia, Chersonesus, and Tyrus, were established by settlers from Miletus and other Greek city-states, creating early urban centers of commerce and Hellenic culture. Through trade with these Greeks, the Scythians exchanged grain, furs, and slaves for wine, olive oil, and crafted goods. By the 3rd century BC, the Scythians were overtaken by the Sarmatians, another group of Iranian-speaking nomads. The Sarmatians controlled the steppe regions for several centuries and were noted for their influence on neighboring peoples, including the early Slavs. Their dominance, however, began to wane under pressure from new waves of migrants, Goths, Huns, and later Avars, who moved across the Eurasian plains between the 2nd and 6th centuries AD. During this same period, the early Slavic tribes began to emerge as a distinct cultural and linguistic group. The origins of the Slavs remain debated, but by the 5th and 6th centuries AD, they were firmly established in the forest steppe zone of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Byzantine and Gothic sources referred to them as Sklavini and Ontes. The Slavs practiced subsistence agriculture, built fortified settlements along rivers, and engaged in trade and warfare with neighboring peoples. The Dnipro, Dniester, and Bug rivers became vital trade routes linking the Baltic and Black Seas, laying the foundation for later economic and political developments. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, the Avar Khaganate exerted control over much of Eastern Europe, influencing the early Slavic tribes. The Slavs paid tribute to the Avars, but also absorbed many elements of their military organization. After the collapse of Avar power in the early 9th century, the Slavs began to consolidate their own local centers of authority. In the forested regions of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, tribes such as the Polans, Drevlians, Severians, and Tvertsi formed loosely organized communities. Each had its own leadership structure, fortified towns, and tribal assemblies. Among these, the Polans, who inhabited the middle Dnipro basin around modern Kyiv, would play a decisive role in the next stage of Ukrainian history. Meanwhile, the steppes south of the Slavic territories continued to see rapid power shifts. The late 7th century brought the rise of the Khazar Khaganate, a Turkic polity that controlled the lower Volga, Don, and Dnipro regions. The Khazars maintained a sophisticated administration, traded extensively with Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, and adopted Judaism as a state religion in the 8th or 9th century. Their presence shaped the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe and influenced the emerging Slavic polities to the north. Many early Slavic leaders paid tribute to the Khazars, and Khazar merchants and soldiers operated throughout the Dnipro basin. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the river routes of Eastern Europe became central to long-distance trade between Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Norse traders and adventurers, known as Varangians, traveled these routes, establishing trading posts and settlements. They traded furs, honey, wax, and slaves from the Slavic lands for silver, silk, and luxury goods from the south. Over time, some Varangian leaders began to assert political control over Slavic territories. According to the primary chronicle compiled in the early 12th century, the Slavic and Finnic tribes invited the Varangian prince Rurik and his kin to rule over them around 862 AD, marking the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty in the northern city of Novgorod. From this foundation, Rurik's successor, Oleg, moved south and seized Kyiv from the Khazars in 882 AD. This event unified the northern and southern trade routes under one authority and established Kyiv as the political center of a new state, Kyivan Rus. It was from this moment that recorded Ukrainian history, in the political and cultural sense, formally begins. In 882 AD, Oleg of Novgorod, a Varangian prince from the Rurikid dynasty, moved south along the Dnipro River and captured the city of Kyiv from local rulers Askold and Dyar. Oleg declared Kyiv the new capital of his realm and proclaimed it the mother of Rus cities. This moment marked the formal beginning of the Kyivan Rus state, a loose federation of East Slavic and Finnic tribes united under the rule of the Varangian elite. The new political center connected northern trade routes from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, making Kyiv a crucial hub in the flow of goods between Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Oleg consolidated his control over the surrounding territories through diplomacy, conquest, and alliances. He extended his influence over the Drevlians, Severians, and Radomics, tribes living along the Dnipro and its tributaries. He also imposed tribute on these groups, securing their loyalty to the Kyivan throne. In 907, Oleg led a successful military expedition against Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. According to the primary chronicle, he nailed his shield to the city gates as a sign of victory and later concluded a trade treaty in 911 that that granted favorable conditions to Rus merchants in Byzantine markets. After Oleg died in 912, power passed to Igor, the son of Rurik. Igor continued the expansion of Kyivan Rus, asserting control over new territories and maintaining trade relations with Byzantium. His reign, however, was marked by internal unrest. In 945, while collecting tribute from the Drevlians, Igor was killed during a revolt. His widow, Princess Olga, assumed power as regent for their young son Sviatoslav. Olga is remembered for reorganizing the tribute system to prevent similar uprisings and for becoming one of the first Rus rulers to adopt Christianity after visiting Constantinople around 957. Although her conversion did not immediately Christianize her people, it laid the groundwork for future religious change. When Sviatoslav reached adulthood, he took command of the state's armies and launched a series of ambitious campaigns. Between 964 and 972, Sviatoslav led military expeditions against the Khazar Khaganate, the Volga Bulgars, and the Balkan territories. He destroyed the Khazar capital of Itil, effectively ending Khazar dominance in the steppe. Sviatoslav then turned his attention to the Balkans, attempting to establish control over the Danube region. His campaigns brought Kyivan Rus into direct conflict with the Byzantine Empire. In 972, while returning from one of these campaigns, Sviatoslav was ambushed and killed by Pecheneg tribes along the Dnipro River. Following his death, Sviatoslav's sons fought for control of the state. Vladimir, ruling from Novgorod, emerged victorious after defeating his brother Yaropolk in 980. Known later as Vladimir the Great, his reign marked a turning point in Kyivan Rus history. He centralized authority, expanded the state's borders, and introduced a new religion that would define its cultural identity. In 988 AD, Vladimir adopted Christianity as the state religion, officially converting the people of Kyivan Rus from traditional Slavic paganism to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. According to the primary chronicle, Vladimir chose Byzantine Christianity after evaluating several faiths. His baptism, followed by the mass conversion of Kiev's population in the Dnipro River, symbolized the religious unification of the realm. This event strengthened political ties with the Byzantine Empire, opened access to Byzantine art and learning, and established the Orthodox Church as a central institution in Rus society. Churches replaced pagan temples, and Byzantine architects, priests, and scholars began to arrive in Kiev, spreading literacy and Christian theology through the Old Church Slavonic language. Vladimir's reign also brought administrative and military reforms. He divided the realm into principalities governed by his sons and loyal nobles to improve control over distant territories. This system allowed greater regional stability, but later created the framework for political fragmentation. Vladimir also fortified Kiev and other major cities, encouraging trade and population growth. By the end of his rule in 1015, Kyivan Rus was one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. After Vladimir's death, a struggle for succession erupted among his sons. The conflict ended with Yaroslav, known as Yaroslav the Wise, securing power in 1019. His reign from 1019 to 1054 is considered the golden age of Kyivan Rus. Yaroslav focused on codifying laws, fostering education, and strengthening international relations. He introduced the Ruska Pravda, Justice of Rus, one of the earliest written legal codes in Eastern Europe, which regulated property rights, criminal law, and compensation systems. This code marked a shift toward a more structured legal society. Yaroslav promoted Christianity as a unifying force and supported the establishment of churches, monasteries, and schools. Under his rule, the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kyiv was constructed, modeled after Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and became a symbol of religious and political prestige. He also established the first metropolitan see in Kyiv, effectively making it the spiritual center of Eastern Slavic lands. Culturally, Kyivan Rus flourished during Yaroslav's reign. He encouraged the translation of Greek religious and philosophical texts into Slavic and sponsored the creation of chronicles that documented historical events. The influence of Byzantine art and architecture spread throughout Rus, visible in mosaics, frescoes, and iconography. Literacy expanded through monastic schools, and the Cyrillic alphabet, adapted from earlier Glagolitic script, became the foundation for written Slavic languages. Diplomatically, Yaroslav secured the position of Kyivan Rus among European powers by marrying his daughters into royal families across the continent. His daughter Anna became Queen of France, while others married into the courts of Norway, Poland, and Hungary. These alliances elevated the prestige of Kyiv, linking it to Western Christendom while maintaining close ties with Byzantium. By the mid-11th century, Kyivan Rus had reached its peak in territorial size and political stability. Its economy was supported by agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. The Dnipro River system facilitated commerce between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Goods such as furs, wax, and honey were exported to Byzantium and Western Europe, while luxury items like silk, glassware, and wine flowed into Kyiv. The city itself became a major center of urban life, estimated to have a population exceeding 50,000, remarkable for its time. After Vladimir the Great consolidated power in 980 AD, Kyivan Rus entered a period of significant transformation. The pagan traditions that had long guided Slavic life were gradually replaced by Christianity, reshaping the state's religion, culture, and governance. Vladimir's decision to convert to Christianity in 988 AD was both a political and cultural act that positioned Kyivan Rus within the sphere of Byzantine civilization. Before conversion, Kyivan Rus had been religiously diverse. Paganism dominated, centered around a pantheon of gods led by Purin, the god of thunder and war. Vladimir initially strengthened pagan worship to unify the realm under a single cult, constructing temples and promoting traditional rituals. However, his later diplomatic interactions, particularly with Byzantium, shifted his priorities. The Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Basil II, sought military assistance to suppress internal revolts. Vladimir agreed to send troops in exchange for marriage to Basil's sister, Anna, on the condition that he adopt Christianity. This alliance elevated Kyivan Rus to the level of recognized Christian monarchies. The mass baptism of Kyiv's inhabitants in the Dnipro River followed Vladimir's conversion, symbolizing the Christianization of the realm. Pagan idols were destroyed, and churches were built in their place. The Church of the Tithes, completed around 996 AD, became the first stone church in Kyiv, funded by a tenth of Vladimir's income. Clergy from Byzantium arrived to organize ecclesiastical life, establish dioceses, and educate new priests. Greek influence became visible in architecture, iconography, and liturgy, while Old Church Slavonic emerged as the liturgical language. Christianization unified the population under a shared faith and legitimized the authority of the ruling dynasty. The new religion provided literacy, record-keeping, and diplomatic channels that linked Kyivan Rus with the wider Christian world. Monastic institutions developed as centers of education and writing. The earliest chronicles began to appear, recording events, rulers, and religious developments. This marked the beginning of written history in the region. Vladimir's reign also strengthened the state's infrastructure. Fortified cities were built across key trade routes to maintain internal control. Local administrators collected tribute and upheld law in the name of the Grand Prince. Trade prospered along the Dnipro River, connecting Scandinavia, the Black Sea, and Byzantium. Foreign merchants brought goods such as silk, wine, and coins from Constantinople and Baghdad. When Vladimir died in 1015, internal conflict erupted among his sons. The struggle ended when Yaroslav, ruling from Novgorod, defeated his brother Sviatopolk in 1019 and became the Grand Prince of Kiev. His reign marked the height of Kyivan Rus's political, cultural, and intellectual development. Yaroslav the Wise implemented a legal code known as the Ruska Pravda, the first codified system of law in Eastern Europe. It outlined penalties for crimes such as theft, murder, and property disputes, emphasizing monetary compensation over corporal punishment. This code demonstrated a transition from tribal justice to a more structured legal order based on written norms. It strengthened the authority of the state and standardized the administration of justice across diverse regions. Under Yaroslav, Kyivan Rus maintained active relations with neighboring states. He pursued dynastic marriages to integrate the realm into European politics. His daughters married into royal families across Europe. Anna became Queen of France, Elizabeth married the King of Norway, and Anastasia became Queen of Hungary. These alliances elevated the status of Kyivan Rus and fostered diplomatic recognition from both Eastern and Western Christendom. Religion continued to shape the state's identity. In 1037, Yaroslav founded the Cathedral of Saint Sophia in Kiev, modeled after Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Its mosaics and frescoes displayed a blend of Byzantine artistry and local craftsmanship. The cathedral became the center of the Kyivan Metropolitanate, an ecclesiastical jurisdiction under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Monasteries multiplied, serving as centers of manuscript production, education, and theological study. The first libraries in the region were created, preserving both religious and secular texts. Education expanded under the church's supervision. Clergy were trained in reading and writing, and the use of Cyrillic script became widespread. The translation of Greek religious works into Old Church Slavonic allowed local populations to access Christian teachings in their own language. The clergy also introduced chronicle writing, which recorded political and religious events, shaping the historical memory of Kyivan Rus. Economically, Yaroslav's rule stabilized the currency system. Silver coins bearing his name circulated widely, signaling the growth of internal markets. Trade with Byzantium remained a cornerstone of the economy, supplemented by exchange with Western Europe and the Middle East. Kiev emerged as a major center for commerce and craftsmanship, producing jewelry, weapons, textiles, and pottery. The city's population included artisans, merchants, and foreign traders, making it one of the most cosmopolitan centers in medieval Europe. The ideological foundation of the Philippine Revolution was laid decades before 1896 through a combination of local grievances, intellectual developments, and historical incidents that exposed the oppressive nature of Spanish colonial rule. One of the earliest catalysts for nationalist consciousness was the execution of three Filipino priests, Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, on February 17, 1872, commonly referred to as the Gamborza. These priests were accused by the Spanish authorities of inciting a mutiny at the Cavite arsenal, despite a lack of concrete evidence linking them to the event. Their trial and subsequent execution by garrote drew widespread condemnation among educated Filipinos and became a symbol of the systemic injustices perpetuated by colonial officials. The Gamborza case highlighted both the lack of legal protection for Filipinos under colonial law and the Spanish authorities' readiness to suppress perceived threats to their control, demonstrating the limits of reform within the colonial system. The period following the Gamborza executions saw the emergence of the propaganda movement, primarily composed of Filipino intellectuals who were educated in Spain and other European countries. Members of this movement included Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano Lopez Gina, and Mariano Ponce. Their central objective was to promote peaceful reform and representation of the Philippines within the Spanish Cortes. The movement was concentrated in publications such as La Solidaridad, which circulated essays, editorials, and commentary on colonial administration, abuses by the friars, and the need for equal rights for Filipinos. The propaganda movement articulated key principles such as secularization of the clergy, representation in government, freedom of speech, and reforms in education. These principles provided an intellectual framework that influenced both reformists and eventual revolutionaries. Jose Rizal's writings played a particularly significant role in shaping Filipino nationalist thought. His novel Nali Mi Tanhair, published in 1887, depicted the social injustices faced by ordinary Filipinos under Spanish rule. It exposed the corruption of local officials, the abuses of the friars, and the widespread social inequality experienced by the population. El Filibusterismo, published in 1891, presented a more critical view of the colonial system and explored the consequences of systemic oppression, emphasizing the urgency of reform and, for some readers, the potential necessity of revolutionary action. While Rizal himself advocated for reform rather than immediate armed revolt, his writings reached a wide audience and provided the ideological basis for the formation of secret revolutionary organizations. Rizal's arguments demonstrated that Spanish colonial policies were incompatible with principles of justice, civic participation, and human dignity, reinforcing the notion that structural change was necessary. Alongside the intellectual movement in Europe, practical events within the Philippines contributed to the development of revolutionary ideology. Local uprisings in the 19th century, such as the Palaris Revolt in Pangasinan, 1762 to 1765, the Daguhoy Rebellion in Bohol, 1744 to 1829, and the Silang Revolt in Ilocos, 1762 to 1763, provided historical examples of Filipino resistance against Spanish authority. These uprisings, though largely unsuccessful, demonstrated that armed resistance was a historically recurring response to colonial abuses, particularly when reform efforts failed or were ignored. The memory of these revolts informed revolutionary leaders of the need for organization, popular support, and military planning. The ideological seeds of the revolution also emerged from growing communication and interaction between provincial leaders and reformists. Filipino elites and local leaders who were aware of abuses in their provinces began to recognize the limitations of petitions, appeals, and negotiations with colonial authorities. They concluded that systemic change required organized collective action rather than isolated or symbolic protests. The interaction between the Ilustrados in Europe and provincial leaders in the Philippines created a network of ideas, where education, reformist literature, and historical awareness converged to form a coherent intellectual foundation for revolutionary activity. Additionally, the proliferation of secret societies within the Philippines before 1892 provided practical structures for revolutionary activity. Some organizations, inspired by Freemasonry and other European secret societies, emphasized loyalty, secrecy, and collective action. These societies provided a model for organizing resistance while minimizing the risk of detection by colonial authorities. They combined ideological education with practical preparation, allowing members to discuss the principles of independence, equality, and national sovereignty in a controlled environment. The Katipunan, later established by Andres Bonifacio, would build directly on this foundation, integrating ideological instruction with concrete revolutionary objectives. By the early 1890s, the combination of historical precedents, reformist ideology, and secret organizational practices created an environment in which the population was receptive to the idea of revolution. Filipinos were aware of the systemic injustices, the limits of reform, and the potential need for coordinated action. This ideological groundwork provided the basis for the emergence of the Katipunan in 1892, ensuring that when the revolution began in 1896, it would not be a spontaneous or isolated uprising, but a movement informed by decades of intellectual and historical preparation. The formation of the Katipunan in 1892 marked the first organized revolutionary movement in the Philippines aimed at achieving complete independence from Spanish colonial rule. The organization emerged in the context of decades of social, political, and economic grievances, combined with the intellectual influence of the propaganda movement. Its creation represented a shift from the reformist efforts advocated by the Ilustrados in Europe to a direct, grassroots approach to liberation. Andres Bonifacio, a resident of Tondo, Manila, is widely recognized as the founder of the Katipunan, officially known as the Katastasong, Kagalingalangang Katipunan ng Mga Anaking Bayan, Supreme and Venerable Society of the Children of the Nation. Born in 1863 to a lower-class family, Bonifacio had limited formal education but gained exposure to political ideas through readings and involvement in local associations. Influenced by the writings of José Rizal and aware of the systemic oppression faced by Filipinos, Bonifacio sought to establish a secret society capable of mobilizing ordinary Filipinos in a coordinated struggle against Spanish authorities. The Katipunan was established as a clandestine organization to avoid detection by Spanish officials who had actively suppressed reformist and nationalist activities. Its structure emphasized secrecy, loyalty, and discipline. The organization adopted a hierarchical system with a Supreme Council, provincial councils, and local cells, ensuring both operational security and effective communication across Manila and the surrounding provinces. Membership initiation involved oaths of allegiance and rituals designed to reinforce unity and commitment. Members pledged loyalty to the Katipunan and a commitment to the cause of independence, agreeing to maintain secrecy under penalty of death. The use of pseudonyms and coded correspondence further protected the identities of members and their families from colonial authorities. Ideologically, the Katipunan centered on the principles of independence, equality, and national sovereignty. The organization advocated for the overthrow of Spanish rule through armed resistance, viewing reform efforts as insufficient and largely ineffective. Unlike the propaganda movement, which relied on petitions, publications, and appeals to the Spanish government, the Katipunan emphasized practical preparation for revolution, including military training, recruitment, and logistical planning. Membership in the Katipunan grew rapidly. By 1896, estimates suggest that the organization had reached approximately 100,000 members, spanning Manila and multiple provinces, including Cavite, Bulacan, Pampanga, and Batangas. Recruitment strategies focused on both educated Filipinos and the working class, particularly laborers, artisans, and small-scale farmers, who were most affected by colonial oppression. The organization's appeal was strengthened by its ability to provide both a political and social network, allowing members to share ideas, organize local initiatives, and coordinate resistance. The Katipunan also developed a system of communication and propaganda to educate members about the objectives and methods of the organization. Written materials, including circulars, leaflets, and manuals, explain the principles of the movement, the structure of the organization, and strategies for evading detection. Leaders emphasized both discipline and unity, ensuring that the society remained cohesive despite the challenges of operating in secrecy under a colonial regime. In addition, the Katipunan established symbols such as flags, emblems, and rituals to reinforce identity and solidarity among members. Internal governance within the Katipunan included the appointment of officials at multiple levels. The Supreme Council, or Supremo, directed overall strategy, while local councils handled recruitment, intelligence gathering, and the coordination of revolutionary activities within provinces. Andres Bonifacio served as the Supremo, responsible for planning operations, maintaining security, and providing ideological guidance to members. Other key figures, including Deodato Arellano, Teodoro Plata, and Valentin Diaz, played critical roles in administration, recruitment, and outreach. By the mid-13th century, the historical legacy of Kyivan Rus survived primarily through its culture, religion, and written tradition. The Orthodox Church preserved continuity, maintaining liturgical practices, chronicles, and education. The population of the devastated southern and central territories gradually recovered, but political control would remain divided under foreign rule for centuries. In the early 13th century, the once powerful Kyivan Rus was already weakened by internal divisions, dynastic conflicts, and regional rivalries. The Mongol expansion into Eastern Europe would deliver the final blow. Beginning in 1237, the armies of Bada Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, advanced westward, destroying entire principalities. In 1237, the Mongols began their campaign against the eastern principalities of Rus. Ryazan was the first to fall, followed by Vladimir and Suzdal. In 1239, they turned south, capturing Pereyaslav and Chernihiv, two key centers of Ukrainian lands. By 1240, The Mongol army reached Kyiv, then ruled by Prince Danilo of Halych as appointed commander, Dmytro. Despite the city's strong fortifications, it was poorly defended. In December 1240, after a long siege, the Mongols breached the walls and sacked Kyiv. Much of the population was killed, and the city, once a flourishing center of Eastern Europe, was left in ruins. The Mongol conquest shattered the political unity of Rus. The territory that corresponds to modern Ukraine became divided among the vassal principalities of the Golden Horde, while the western regions, Volhynia and Galicia, retained more autonomy. Danilo Romanovich, known as Danilo of Halych, emerged as a key figure in western Ukraine. He sought to rebuild the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia and consolidate power. In 1245, Danilo defeated rival boyars and Hungarian and Polish forces at the Battle of Yaroslav, securing his rule. He then sought recognition from the papacy to strengthen his position against the Mongols. In 1253, Pope Innocent IV crowned him as King of Rus in Dorohaikin, making Danilo the only Ruthenian ruler formally recognized as king by the Western Church. Despite this, Danilo was forced to acknowledge the supremacy of the Mongols and send tribute to the Golden Horde. Danilo attempted to resist Mongol authority through diplomacy and alliances. He maintained contact with Western Europe and even considered participating in anti-Mongol coalitions. However, no significant Western aid materialized. The Mongols maintained their dominance over the Ukrainian steppe and principalities, collecting tributes and influencing the appointment of local princes. After Danilo died in 1264, his successors struggled to maintain unity. Internal conflicts and pressure from neighboring powers, Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania, eroded the stability of Galicia-Volhynia. The Mongols continued to raid and assert authority, while the Western neighbors expanded their influence. By the late 13th century, Kyiv had lost its political significance. The city became a minor provincial center under Mongol oversight. The once unified Rus civilization was now split between eastern territories ruled by Mongol vassals and western lands developing under European influence. The decline of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century gradually weakened the Golden Horde's control over the Ukrainian territories. The Lithuanian Grand Duchy, expanding from the north, began to take advantage of this power vacuum. Lithuanian princes, through both conquest and diplomacy, gained control over the Kyiv, Volhynian, and Chernihiv lands. In 1362, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Algirdas, led his army southward to confront the Mongols of the Golden Horde in the Battle of Blue Waters, fought near the modern city of Pervomaysk. The Lithuanian forces defeated the Mongol troops, ending the direct Mongol domination over much of central Ukraine. Following this victory, most of the Ukrainian lands, including Kyiv, became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Local princes continued to rule, but under Lithuanian authority. The Lithuanians generally allowed existing legal, administrative, and religious structures to remain, creating a degree of continuity with the old Rus traditions. During the 14th century, the influence of the Mongols declined further and the balance of power in Eastern Europe shifted. The western regions of Ukraine, Galicia, and parts of Volhynia fell under Polish control, while the central and northern territories remained within the Lithuanian sphere. This period marked the beginning of a dual political and cultural alignment that would shape Ukraine's later history. The western lands leaning toward Poland and the Latin Christian world, and the eastern and central lands connected to Lithuania and the Orthodox tradition of Rus. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol domination that began with the fall of Kyiv in 1240 had largely ended, but its legacy endured. The destruction of urban centers, depopulation of key regions, and fragmentation of political authority left long-term effects. The era of Mongol rule had permanently altered the map of Eastern Europe and opened the path for new powers, Lithuania and Poland, to dominate Ukrainian lands in the centuries to come. After the Lithuanian victory over the Mongols at the Battle of Blue Waters in 1362, much of the territory that forms present-day central and northern Ukraine came under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Lithuanian rulers, beginning with Grand Duke Algirdas, pursued a policy of accommodation rather than domination. They allowed the local Ruthenian, East Slavic, nobility to retain their lands, laws, and Orthodox faith. The official language of administration remained Old Ruthenian, derived from the written language of Kyivan Rus. This policy allowed the Lithuanian state to integrate Ukrainian territories without large-scale resistance. Throughout the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Lithuanian control expanded further south and east, reaching as far as Kyiv, Podolia, and Bratislava. The Lithuanian Grand Duchy became a multi-ethnic and multi-religious federation that included Lithuanians, Ruthenians, and Belarusians. Many of its administrative customs were rooted in the traditions of Kyivan Rus. Meanwhile, Western Ukrainian territories, especially Galicia and parts of Volhynia, fell under the Kingdom of Poland. In 1349, King Casimir III of Poland annexed Galicia after defeating local rulers. By the end of the 14th century, the entire region was integrated into the Polish crown. Polish authority introduced Latin Christianity and Western European feudal structures, reshaping the region's social hierarchy. Local Orthodox nobles often converted to Catholicism to retain influence under Polish rule. The growing contact between the Lithuanian and Polish elites led to dynastic unification. In 1386, Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania converted to Christianity and married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, becoming King the Ladisław II Jagiello. This personal union between Lithuania and Poland created the foundation of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. During the 15th century, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania remained largely autonomous, though its political orientation increasingly shifted toward Poland. The Ukrainian territories under Lithuanian rule experienced relative stability compared to the Mongol period. Cities such as Kyiv and Lutsk became regional centers of trade and religion. Orthodox monasteries and schools preserved the cultural and literary traditions of Rus. However, new challenges arose. The southern frontier, particularly the steppe region near the Black Sea, became vulnerable to raids by Crimean Tatars after the formation of the Crimean Khanate in 1441. The Tatars, vassals of the Ottoman Empire, launched frequent incursions into Ukrainian lands, capturing people for slavery and plundering settlements. These raids devastated southern Ukraine for centuries, hindering economic development and settlement. By the early 16th century, the Polish influence over Lithuania deepened. Polish nobles and clergy promoted Catholicism and Western-style governance. In Ukrainian lands, particularly Volhynia, Podolia, and Kyiv, the Lithuanian system of local autonomy began to weaken. The Orthodox Church remained dominant among the local population, but it lacked the political protection it once had under independent rulers. the cultural and social divide widened. The Polish aristocracy, szlachta, gained privileges through the Golden Liberty system, which emphasized noble self-government and parliamentary rule. In contrast, the Ruthenian nobility lost status and autonomy. The Polish language began to replace Ruthenian as the language of administration and elite culture in western and central Ukraine. Economically, the Ukrainian lands played a key role in grain production, trade, and transit routes connecting the Baltic and Black Seas. Towns such as Lviv and Kamianets-Podilskyi prospered under Magdeburg law, which granted them municipal self-governance similar to Western European cities. However, the growing Polish control meant that Ukrainian peasants increasingly fell into serfdom, tied to noble estates, and obligated to provide labor and taxes. By the mid-16th century, the Polish-Lithuanian relationship had become increasingly intertwined. Facing threats from Muscovy in the east and the Ottoman Empire in the south, both states sought a closer political union for defense and stability. This culminated in the Union of Lublin in 1569, a treaty that formally united the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland into a single political entity, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As part of the union, large portions of the Ukrainian territories previously under Lithuanian control, Kyiv, Bratislava, and Volodymyr, were transferred to direct Polish administration. This act marked a major turning point in Ukrainian history. The Lithuanian era, characterized by a measure of local autonomy and Orthodox tolerance, gave way to direct Polish rule that emphasized Catholic dominance and centralized governance. From 1569 onward, nearly all Ukrainian lands, except for those under Ottoman or Crimean control, became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This transformation would have long-lasting consequences for Ukraine's political, religious, and cultural development in the following centuries. By the early 17th century, the social and political structure of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had created deep divisions in Ukrainian society. Most of the population consisted of Orthodox peasants subjected to the control of Polish landlords and Catholic magnates. The Orthodox Church faced restrictions, especially after the Union of Brest in 1596, which created the Uniate Greek Catholic Church and subordinated parts of the Orthodox hierarchy to the authority of Rome. Many Ukrainian nobles converted to Catholicism to retain privileges, further isolating the Orthodox majority. In the southern steppe frontier, a new social force emerged, the Cossacks. Composed of runaway peasants, adventurers, and soldiers, they organized themselves into self-governing military communities. Their main center, the Zaporizhian Sich, located beyond the Dnipro River rapids, functioned as both a fortress and a republic. The Cossacks maintained their own elected leaders, or hetmans, and lived under a code of discipline and equality. Throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Cossacks served both as defenders of the Commonwealth and as a source of instability. They conducted raids into Ottoman and Tatar territories, and at times fought in wars on behalf of Poland against the Ottomans and Muscovy. The Polish government attempted to control them by creating a registered Cossack force, a limited number officially employed and paid by the state, but the majority remained outside legal recognition, leading to frequent uprisings. The most significant of these revolts began in 1648 under the leadership of Bohdan Khmelnytsky. A noble-born Cossack officer, Khmelnytsky sought redress after a personal dispute with a Polish magnate escalated into a broader confrontation. His cause quickly gained mass support from Cossacks, Orthodox peasants, and townsmen resentful of Polish domination. The uprising spread rapidly across central and eastern Ukraine. In 1648, Cossack forces achieved a series of major victories over Polish armies at Zavdy Vody, Korsun, and Pilyavtsi. These defeats destabilized the Commonwealth and forced negotiations. Khmelnytsky aimed to secure autonomy for the Cossack state, the restoration of Orthodox rights, and limits on Polish aristocratic power in Ukrainian lands. However, shifting alliances and the reluctance of the Polish Sejm to recognize a permanent settlement prolonged the conflict. In 1654, seeking protection against renewed Polish offensives, Khmelnytsky signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with Tsar Alexis of Muscovy. The treaty placed the Cossack Hetmanate under the suzerainty of the Russian Tsar in exchange for military and political support. The exact terms were ambiguous, and interpretations of the treaty's nature, whether it represented union, alliance, or vassalage, became a matter of later dispute. The subsequent Russo-Polish War, 1654 to 1667, devastated Ukraine. Fighting and shifting control divided the country along the Dnipro River. The Truce of Andrusovo in 1667 formalized this division. Left Bank Ukraine, including Kyiv, came under Moscow's rule, while Right Bank Ukraine remained under Polish control. This partition effectively ended hopes for a unified Cossack state. In the Left Bank Hetmanate, a semi-autonomous government continued under the authority of the hetman, based in cities such as Bachrin and later Hlukhiv. The Hetmanate maintained its own administrative structure, military, and fiscal system, though Moscow increasingly interfered in its affairs. Hetmans like Ivan Mazepa sought to preserve autonomy by balancing relations with Russia and other powers. Mazepa's rebellion in 1708, during the Great Northern War, marked a decisive turning point. After forming an alliance with Sweden against Peter the Great, Mazepa was defeated at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Moscow responded by tightening control over Ukrainian institutions, executing Mazepa's supporters, and reducing the Hetmanate's independence. Throughout the 18th century, Russian authority over the Hetmanate expanded. The office of the hetman was suspended several times and finally abolished in 1764 by Catherine the Great. Administrative reforms integrated Ukrainian lands directly into the Russian imperial system. The last vestiges of the Zaporizhian Sich were eliminated in 1775 when Russian troops destroyed the Cossack fortress and dispersed its population. During this period, Right Bank Ukraine under Polish rule experienced a similar decline in local autonomy. Polish magnates expanded their estates, deepening serfdom among peasants. The Orthodox Church remained marginalized, though the Uniate Church retained influence. Repeated Cossack and peasant uprisings, known as Holodomor rebellions, erupted in the 1730s and 1760s, reflecting continued resistance to social and religious oppression. By the mid-18th century, the Cossack order that had defined Ukrainian political life for over 2 centuries was dismantled. The lands that once formed the Cossack Hetmanate became provinces of the Russian Empire, while western regions remained under Polish control. The territorial and administrative fragmentation of Ukraine persisted until the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century. After the abolition of the Hetmanate in 1764 and the destruction of the Zaporizhian Sich in 1775, Ukraine lost the last remaining symbols of its autonomy. These actions marked the consolidation of imperial control by Russia and Poland over Ukrainian territories. The geopolitical balance of the region shifted drastically during the final decades of the 18th century. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal political paralysis and external pressures, underwent three successive partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795. As a result, almost all Ukrainian lands were absorbed into two empires: the Russian Empire in the east and center, and the Habsburg, Austrian, Empire in the west. The first partition of Poland in 1772 gave the Habsburg monarchy control of Galicia, including Lviv, then Lemberg, and the surrounding regions, which they renamed the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. The second partition in 1793 brought right-bank Ukraine, including Kyiv, Podylia, and Volhynia, under Russian control. The third and final partition in 1795 erased Poland from the map entirely, leaving Ukrainian territories divided between St. Petersburg and Vienna. In the Russian Empire, Ukraine was reorganized into several administrative regions. The Little Russian Governorate, later split into Chernihiv and Poltava, and the Kyiv Governorate covering the central lands. Southern territories, annexed after Russia's wars with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate, were incorporated into the so-called New Russia, Novorossiya region. The Crimean Khanate, which had dominated the Black Sea steppe since the 15th century, was annexed by Russia in 1783. This gave the empire access to the northern Black Sea coast and established cities such as Odessa, Kherson, and Sevastopol as new centers of trade and naval power. The imperial government pursued active colonization and economic development of these southern lands. Settlers from Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and other regions were invited to populate the fertile steppe. While the region prospered agriculturally, its demographic composition became increasingly mixed, and the Ukrainian peasantry remained bound by serfdom. By the early 19th century, the majority of Ukraine's rural population were serfs working on large estates owned by Russian nobles or newly established landlords loyal to the empire. In contrast, Austrian-ruled Galicia developed under a different political and social framework. The Habsburg administration implemented a more bureaucratic and legalistic system, introducing certain reforms after 1772. Under Emperor Joseph II, serfdom was partially reduced, and education policies encouraged literacy. Although German became the official administrative language, the Ukrainian, Ruthenian population retained greater opportunities to organize cultural and religious institutions than their counterparts under Russian rule. The Greek Catholic Church, united with Rome since the Union of Brest, played a central role in maintaining Ukrainian national identity. The 19th century brought the rise of modern nationalism across Europe, and Ukraine was no exception. In Russian-controlled Ukraine, the early national awakening was led by intellectuals and writers. The publication of Taras Shevchenko's Kobzar in 1840 was a pivotal cultural moment. Shevchenko's poetry, written in the Ukrainian language, depicted the suffering of the common people and celebrated Ukraine's historical past. His work, alongside that of other members of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, founded in Kyiv in 1846, called for a federation of Slavic peoples and the revival of Ukrainian culture and autonomy. The movement was suppressed by the Tsarist authorities, and Shevchenko was arrested and exiled. Imperial policy toward Ukrainian identity hardened in the second half of the 19th century. The Valuev Circular of 1863 restricted the publication of religious and educational texts in Ukrainian, claiming that the Ukrainian language never existed. The EMSU case of 1876, issued by Tsar Alexander II, went further, banning most Ukrainian language publications, theatrical performances, and public use. The intent was to assimilate Ukrainians into the broader Russian nation and eliminate regional distinctions. Despite these restrictions, a distinct Ukrainian identity persisted. Secret societies, reading circles, and ethnographic studies continued to promote the language and history of Ukraine. In rural areas, peasants maintained traditional customs and folklore that preserved a sense of continuity with earlier periods. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 freed millions of peasants, but left them with limited land and heavy financial obligations. Economic inequalities remained severe, and industrialization, particularly in the eastern regions of Donbass and around Kharkiv, introduced new class divisions by the late 19th century. Under Austrian rule, Galicia became the most important center of Ukrainian political and cultural life. The Austrian government, seeking to counterbalance Polish influence, allowed limited self-governance through the Galician Diet established in 1861. However, real power remained in the hands of the Polish aristocracy. Despite this, Ukrainian language schools, newspapers, and cultural associations emerged in Lviv. The establishment of the Prose Vita Society in 1868 and the Shevchenko Scientific Society in 1873 marked key milestones in the development of Ukrainian education and scholarship. By the late 19th century, political organizations began to form. In 1890, the first Ukrainian political party, the Ruthenian Ukrainian Radical Party, was founded in Lviv, advocating land reform and social justice. Other parties followed, reflecting liberal, socialist, and national democratic currents. Galicia also became a recruiting ground for the early Ukrainian national movement that would later play a major role in the events following World War I. In both empires, modernization brought demographic and social transformation. The population of Ukrainian territories grew significantly, and cities expanded with the growth of industry, trade, and transport. Railroads connected Odessa, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv to imperial markets. The Black Sea ports facilitated exports of grain and raw materials. Yet, political repression and censorship remained constants under both Russian and Austrian rule. By the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainian society was increasingly divided by class, religion, and geography. The intelligentsia and urban workers became more politically active, inspired by socialist and nationalist ideologies circulating throughout Europe. The 1905 Russian Revolution temporarily loosened restrictions in the empire, allowing Ukrainian newspapers and organizations to reappear, though most were soon suppressed again. On the eve of World War I, Ukraine remained partitioned between two imperial powers. In the Russian Empire, the population exceeded 30 million, while in Austrian Galicia, approximately 4 million Ukrainians lived under Habsburg rule. The suppression of political autonomy and language rights had failed to erase Ukrainian identity. Instead, it had fostered a growing sense of national consciousness across social classes. The collision of these forces, empire, modernization, and nationalism, set the stage for the next phase of Ukrainian history. When the First World War began in 1914, These divisions would determine how Ukraine's fragmented lands responded to the collapse of the old European order. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Ukrainian lands were divided between two rival empires, the Russian Empire in the east and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the west. This division placed Ukrainians on opposing sides of the conflict. In the east, millions were conscripted into the Russian army. In the west, hundreds of thousands served in the Austro-Hungarian forces. The front lines soon cut directly through Ukrainian territory, devastating cities, villages, and agricultural land. The Russian government viewed Ukrainians under Austrian rule with suspicion, claiming that the idea of a separate Ukrainian nation was a product of Austrian propaganda. When Russian troops captured Lviv and parts of Galicia in 1914, they launched a campaign of repression against the local Ukrainian intelligentsia and clergy. Hundreds of priests of the Greek Catholic Church were arrested or deported to Siberia. The Russian authorities aimed to integrate Galicia into the empire as part of a broader plan to reunite all Eastern Slavs under Russian rule. In contrast, the Austro-Hungarian government initially tolerated Ukrainian cultural activity within its borders. In Lviv, Ukrainian politicians and intellectuals formed the Supreme Ukrainian Council in 1914, supporting Austria-Hungary and advocating for the creation of a unified Ukrainian state under Habsburg protection. A volunteer military unit, the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, was organized to fight against Russia. The unit served not only as a military formation, but also as a symbol of emerging Ukrainian national identity. The prolonged war caused severe social and economic collapse across Ukrainian territories. Millions of civilians were displaced, and agricultural production declined sharply. By 1917, both empires were facing internal crises. In the Russian Empire, the February Revolution of 1917 overthrew Tsar Nicholas II and established the provisional government. In this context of political upheaval, Ukrainian leaders saw an opportunity to pursue self-determination. In March 1917, Ukrainian political activists in Kyiv formed the Central Rada, or Central Council, led by historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. The Rada represented various political, social, and cultural organizations, advocating for autonomy within a federated Russia. In June 1917, it issued its first universal, declaring Ukraine's right to self-government. The provisional government in Petrograd initially resisted, but later recognized the Rada as authority over 5 central Ukrainian provinces. The situation changed dramatically after the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. The Central Rada, unwilling to accept Bolshevik rule, proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, on November 20, 1917, through its third universal. It sought democratic reforms, land redistribution, and neutrality in the ongoing war. However, conflict with the Bolsheviks soon followed. In January 1918, Bolshevik forces led by Vladimir Antonovchenko invaded Ukraine, capturing Kyiv in February. Facing military defeat, the Rada sought external assistance. On February 9, 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. In exchange for food supplies, the Central Powers recognized Ukraine's independence and sent troops to drive out the Bolsheviks. Kyiv was retaken in March 1918. The German occupation, however, replaced one form of domination with another. The Central Powers established a conservative government under Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky in April 1918. Skoropadsky, a former general of the Russian army, dissolved the Central Rada and declared the formation of the Ukrainian state, often referred to as the Hetmanate. His regime restored private property, centralized authority, and sought cooperation with the German military command. While Skoropadsky promoted Ukrainian culture and education, his reliance on foreign powers and conservative policies alienated many nationalists and peasants. The Hetmanate collapsed after Germany's defeat in November 1918. Skoropadsky abdicated, and a new government, the Directorate, led by Simon Petlura and Volodymyr Vinnichenko, assumed power. The Directorate restored the Ukrainian People's Republic and attempted to consolidate control. However, the country quickly descended into chaos. Competing armies, Bolsheviks, White Russians, Polish forces, and anarchist partisans led by Nestor Makhno, fought for dominance. By early 1919, the Bolsheviks once again captured Kyiv, establishing the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Petlura's forces retreated westward, continuing to resist. Meanwhile, in western Ukraine, the collapse of Austria-Hungary in November 1918 led to the proclamation of the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, in Lviv. The new republic controlled Galicia and parts of Bukovina and Transcarpathia. Its leaders, headed by Kyivan Rus, aimed to unite with the Ukrainian People's Republic to form a single independent state. On January 22, 1919, the Act of Unification was proclaimed in Kyiv, symbolically merging the UNR and ZUNR into one Ukrainian republic. In practice, however, the union remained largely ceremonial, as both governments faced separate military struggles. The Polish army launched an offensive against the ZUNR in Galicia, capturing Lviv by mid-1919. In the east, Bolshevik forces advanced further into Ukrainian territory. Petlura, now the principal leader of the UNR, sought an alliance with Poland to resist the Bolsheviks. On April 21, 1920, he signed an agreement with Polish leader Józef Pilsudski, recognizing Poland's control over western Ukraine in exchange for military assistance. The joint Polish-Ukrainian offensive captured Kyiv in May 1920, but was short-lived. A counterattack by the Red Army forced both armies to retreat. The Polish-Soviet War ended with the Treaty of Riga on March 18, 1921. Under its terms, western Ukraine, Galicia, and Volhynia remained part of Poland, while the rest of Ukraine was incorporated into Soviet Russia as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Ukrainian People's Republic ceased to exist as a functioning state. Petlura went into exile, where he was later assassinated in Paris in 1926. The years between 1917 and 1921 marked the first modern attempt to establish an independent Ukrainian state after centuries of foreign domination. Despite its failure, the period laid the groundwork for the future Ukrainian national movement. The experience of the Central Rada, the Hetmanate, the Directorate, and the West Ukrainian People's Republic provided political and institutional precedents that would later influence the re-emergence of Ukrainian sovereignty in the 20th century. The 19th century marked a turning point for Ukrainian lands under imperial rule. By this time, Ukraine was divided primarily between two empires: the Russian Empire in the east and center, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the west, particularly in Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. Each empire imposed its own administrative, cultural, and linguistic policies, but the century also witnessed the gradual awakening of Ukrainian national identity. Under the Russian Empire, most Ukrainian territories, including Kyiv, Poltava, and Kharkiv, were subjected to Russification policies. The Russian government viewed Ukrainian identity as an offshoot of Russian culture and language, not a distinct nation. In 1804, the Russian Ministry of Education banned the teaching of Ukrainian in schools. The imperial administration systematically discouraged the publication of Ukrainian literature and even the use of the term Ukraine, preferring Little Russia. Despite these restrictions, Ukrainian intellectual life persisted underground and through limited local networks. In contrast, Western Ukraine under Austrian control had relatively more cultural freedom. The Austrian Empire, especially after the 1848 revolutions, allowed limited political and cultural participation. The 1848 uprising in Lviv saw the formation of the Supreme Ruthenian Council, the first modern Ukrainian political organization. The council demanded recognition of the Ukrainian language and administrative equality for Ukrainians in Galicia. This period also marked the growing influence of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which became a center for cultural preservation and education. The 19th century also witnessed the rise of intellectual movements shaping modern Ukrainian consciousness. Writers and historians played a decisive role in defining the Ukrainian national narrative. Mikhailo Maximovich, Mykola Kostomarov, and particularly Taras Shevchenko helped articulate a distinct Ukrainian identity. Shevchenko's poetry, written in Ukrainian, celebrated the peasantry and lamented centuries of subjugation. His 1840 collection, Kobzar, became the cultural cornerstone of modern Ukrainian literature. By the mid-19th century, Kharkiv and Kyiv emerged as intellectual centers. The Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius, founded in Kyiv in 1845, advocated for a federation of Slavic peoples that would respect Ukrainian autonomy. Russian authorities suppressed the organization in 1847, arresting Shevchenko and other members, but their ideas spread quietly. The late 19th century saw the growth of Ukrainian language publications, cultural societies, and rural reading clubs known as Prosvita, Enlightenment, in Galicia. In the Russian-controlled territories, restrictions tightened further. The Valuev Circular of 1863 prohibited most publications in Ukrainian, declaring that the Ukrainian language never existed, does not exist, and shall not exist. This policy was reinforced by the EMSU case of 1876, which banned Ukrainian language printing, performances, and education outside ethnographic and folklore contexts. Nevertheless, Ukrainian intellectuals continued to publish works abroad, especially in Austrian Galicia, which became a refuge for writers and political activists from Russian repression. Economically, the 19th century transformed Ukraine through industrialization and modernization, particularly in the south and east. The construction of railways and the development of coal mining in the Donbass region and metallurgy in Kryvyi Rh turned Ukraine into one of the Russian Empire's main industrial zones. Urbanization created a growing working class, though most Ukrainians remained rural peasants. The social gap between urban elites, often Russian or Polish, and Ukrainian peasants deepened the sense of alienation. The decline of serfdom also reshaped Ukrainian society. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in the Russian Empire. Millions of Ukrainian peasants gained personal freedom but not economic independence, as most were forced to buy back small plots at inflated prices. Discontent simmered in the countryside, fueling both socialist and nationalist ideas among students and emerging political thinkers. By the end of the 19th century, Ukrainian nationalism had evolved from a literary and cultural movement into an organized political effort. In Austria and Galicia, Ukrainian representatives began entering local parliaments. The Ukrainian National Democratic Party, founded in 1899, demanded autonomy for Ukrainians within the Habsburg Empire. In the Russian Empire, political reform movements like the Hromadas, communities, worked clandestinely to promote Ukrainian culture and rights. The early 20th century intensified political unrest across Eastern Europe. In the Russian Empire, the 1905 revolution temporarily loosened restrictions, allowing Ukrainian-language newspapers and cultural associations to re-emerge. The Rada newspaper and Ukrainian Scientific Society in Kyiv were established during this short period of openness. However, repression soon returned under Tsar Nicholas II. Meanwhile, Western Ukrainians under Austria-Hungary continued to organize politically. The Sich and Plast youth organizations promoted national education and self-defense. Ukrainian deputies in the Vienna parliament advocated for language rights and land reforms. By the 1910s, Ukrainian political consciousness had matured into a mass movement capable of unified action. When World War I began in 1914, the Ukrainian question gained new urgency. The front lines ran directly through Ukrainian lands, dividing families and communities between rival empires. Ukrainians fought on both sides, those in Galicia under Austria-Hungary and those in the east under Russia. Each empire accused Ukrainian activists of treason and espionage. The Russian army, during its 1915 advance into Galicia, deported and executed suspected Ukrainian nationalists. In response, the Austro-Hungarian government supported the formation of the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, a volunteer military unit within its army. These soldiers viewed their service as part of a broader struggle for national independence. Political exiles in Austria established the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, which sought to create an independent Ukrainian state allied with the Central Powers. By 1917, the collapse of the Russian Empire during the February Revolution changed everything. Centuries of imperial domination had fractured, and for the first time in modern history, Ukrainians had the opportunity to assert political sovereignty. Intellectual, military, and social movements that had developed through the 19th century now converged in a single goal: the creation of an independent Ukrainian state. The long era of imperial subjugation, censorship, and cultural suppression had forged a resilient national identity. The next phase, beginning with the 1917 revolutions, would bring that identity to the forefront of European politics and ignite a struggle for independence that would define modern Ukraine. The year 1917 was a defining moment in Eastern European history. The collapse of the Russian Empire following the February Revolution opened a brief window for political reorganization across its territories. In Kyiv, Ukrainian politicians, soldiers, and intellectuals moved quickly to form a representative body known as the Central Rada Council. It was established in March 1917 as a national assembly representing political parties, peasants, workers, and soldiers. Mikhailo Hrushevsky, a historian and academic, became its head. Initially, the Central Rada did not demand full independence. Its early goal was autonomy within a federated, democratic Russia. On June 10, 1917, the Rada issued its first universal, declaring Ukraine's right to self-governance and the creation of a national executive body, the General Secretariat. The Russian Provisional Government in Petrograd, led by Alexander Kerensky, resisted these moves but was forced to negotiate after mass support for the Rada grew in Ukraine. In July 1917, the Second Universal reaffirmed Ukraine's autonomy while acknowledging the authority of the provisional government until a Russian Constituent Assembly could meet. This uneasy compromise ended abruptly when the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd during the October Revolution of 1917. The Central Rada refused to recognize Bolshevik authority, arguing that Ukraine would govern itself independently of the new Soviet regime. On November 20, 1917, the Rada issued its third universal, proclaiming the establishment of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR. It declared Kyiv as its capital and announced democratic principles, land reforms, and equality for all nationalities. However, it still maintained nominal federation with a non-Bolshevik Russia. The situation changed quickly. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, saw Ukraine's independence as a threat to their control over former imperial territories. In December 1917, they organized an alternative government in Kharkiv, proclaiming the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and declaring war on the Rada. By early 1918, Bolshevik forces, commanded by Mikhail Muravyov, advanced toward Kyiv, capturing the city in February after intense fighting. The Central Rada retreated westward. Desperate for support, the Rada turned to the Central Powers. On February 9, 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and Austria-Hungary, securing military assistance in exchange for food supplies and raw materials. German and Austro-Hungarian troops entered Ukraine, expelled Bolshevik forces, and restored the Rada's authority in Kyiv by March 1918. However, the alliance came at a cost. The Germans considered the Rada inefficient and unstable. On April 29, 1918, they backed a coup led by General Pavlo Skoropadsky, who dissolved the Central Rada and declared himself Hetman of Ukraine. This regime, known as the Hetmanate, aimed to restore conservative order, strengthen the economy, and centralize administration. Skoropadsky reversed land redistribution policies and sought closer ties with Germany. His rule was short-lived. When Germany and Austria-Hungary collapsed in November 1918 at the end of World War I, Skoropadsky lost his main supporters. Ukrainian opposition forces, led by the Directory, a coalition formed by Simon Petlura and Volodymyr Vinnichenko, rose against him. On December 14, 1918, Skoropadsky abdicated and fled Kyiv. The Directory restored the Ukrainian People's Republic. At the same time, events in western Ukraine unfolded differently. With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in October 1918, Ukrainians in Galicia proclaimed the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, on November 1, 1918, with Lviv as its capital. The ZUNR government, led by Kyivan Rus, declared independence from Austria and sought unity with the Kyiv-based UNR. On January 22, 1919, the two republics formally united in the Act of Unification, Act Zluky, symbolically creating one Ukrainian state. The unity was more symbolic than practical. Both republics faced military crises. In the West, the ZUNR was at war with Poland over control of eastern Galicia, particularly Lviv. In the east, the UNR was under pressure from multiple fronts: Bolshevik forces from the north and east, White Russian armies under General Anton Denikin from the south, and renewed Polish ambitions in the west. By early 1919, Kyiv changed hands repeatedly. The Directory's forces, poorly equipped and divided by internal politics, could not withstand coordinated attacks. The Red Army captured Kyiv again in February 1919, establishing the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, UKRSSR. The Bolsheviks implemented land redistribution and sought to integrate Ukraine into the emerging Soviet Federation. In 1920, the UNR made a final attempt to restore independence through an alliance with Poland. On April 21, 1920, the Warsaw Agreement was signed between Simon Petlura and Polish leader Józef Pilsudski. Poland recognized the UNR's government in exile, while Petlura agreed to cede western Ukrainian territories to Poland in exchange for military assistance. The joint Polish-Ukrainian offensive temporarily recaptured Kyiv in May 1920, but collapsed within weeks under a counterattack by the Red Army. The subsequent Polish-Soviet War, 1919 to 1921, determined Ukraine's fate. The Treaty of Riga, signed on March 18, 1921, divided Ukrainian territories between Poland and Soviet Russia. Western Ukraine, including Galicia and Volhynia, became part of Poland, while the central, eastern, and southern regions were incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Simon Petlura's forces continued guerrilla resistance until late 1921, but without external support, the Ukrainian People's Republic ceased to exist. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and officials fled to exile in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France. By the end of 1921, Ukraine had endured multiple governments: imperial, nationalist, socialist, and foreign occupations, all within 4 years. The wars, epidemics, and famine that accompanied these conflicts devastated the population. Although Ukraine failed to secure lasting independence, the experience of statehood during this period left a permanent imprint on national consciousness. It provided a political and historical foundation for the idea of a sovereign Ukrainian nation, which would resurface throughout the 20th century. Following the military collapse of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Bolsheviks consolidated control over most Ukrainian territories. In December 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainian SSR, became one of the 4 founding republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, alongside Russia, Belarus, and Transcaucasia. The formation of the USSR formalized Ukraine's absorption into the Soviet federal structure, but in practice, political and economic authority remained centralized in Moscow. The early 1920s were a period of reconstruction after years of war and devastation. Industrial centers like Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Donetsk were heavily damaged, and agricultural output had collapsed. The Bolshevik leadership introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP, in 1921, allowing limited private enterprise and market exchange to stabilize the economy. This policy extended to Ukraine, where small-scale farmers and traders were permitted to operate under state supervision. Kharkiv was chosen as the capital of Soviet Ukraine in 1919, symbolizing its integration into the Soviet system. Kyiv, although historically significant, was considered too close to the Polish border and less politically reliable. The Communist Party of Ukraine, CPU, formally established in 1918, became the ruling political organization in the republic, though it remained subordinate to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, in Moscow. During this decade, the Soviet leadership initiated a policy of Ukrainization, Ukrainizatsiya, as part of a broader campaign known as Korenizatsiya, or indigenization. Introduced in 1923, this policy aimed to promote local languages and cultures within the Soviet republics to gain legitimacy among non-Russian populations. In Ukraine, this led to a significant expansion of Ukrainian language education, publications, and administration. Ukrainian replaced Russian in many schools, government offices, and cultural institutions. By 1927, Ukrainian language newspapers accounted for the majority of press circulation, and the number of Ukrainian language schools exceeded Russian ones. Universities in Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Odessa began training teachers, scientists, and officials in Ukrainian. The policy also encouraged the participation of Ukrainians in the Communist Party and local government. Prominent Ukrainian intellectuals, such as Mykola Skrypynyk and Oleksandr Shumsky, became advocates of national development within the socialist framework. At the same time, the Soviet state maintained strict control over political expression. The GPU, State Political Directorate, later renamed the OGPU, monitored intellectuals, writers, and former members of nationalist movements. Any hint of separatism or anti-Soviet activity was suppressed. The Communist Party defined Ukrainization as a cultural process, not a political one. It was intended to build loyalty to the Soviet regime rather than encourage independence. Economically, Ukraine remained vital to the Soviet Union. The republic's fertile lands were a key source of grain, while its coal, iron, and steel industries were crucial for reconstruction. Under the NEP, agricultural output gradually recovered. Peasants, who made up over 80% of the population, benefited from reduced requisitions and the ability to sell surplus produce. By 1926, grain harvests approached pre-war levels, and limited consumer markets reappeared in towns and cities. The 1926 Soviet census recorded a population of approximately 29 million in Ukraine, of whom about 80% identified as ethnically Ukrainian. The rest included significant minorities: Russians, Jews, Poles, Germans, and others. Urban centers such as Kharkiv and Odessa remained ethnically mixed, while rural areas were overwhelmingly Ukrainian-speaking. Culturally, the 1920s saw what later became known as the Ukrainian Renaissance. Writers like Mykola Kvilovy, Valerian Pidmohilny, and Les Kurbas explored modernist and experimental themes within the constraints of Soviet ideology. The literary movement Vaplite, Free Academy of Proletarian Literature, emerged in Kharkiv, promoting Ukrainian language literature with global awareness. The theater and film industries also developed rapidly, particularly through the work of directors like Oleksandr Dovzhenko, whose films from the late 1920s reflected both socialist ideals and Ukrainian cultural identity. This period of cultural growth, however, coexisted with growing tension between Ukrainian national expression and Moscow's central authority. By the late 1920s, as Joseph Stalin consolidated power after Lenin died in 1924, the political climate began to shift. Stalin distrusted local nationalism and viewed Ukrainization as a potential threat to Soviet unity. In 1928, the Soviet government launched the first five-year plan, marking the transition from the NEP to a fully planned, state-controlled economy. The plan prioritized rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture across the USSR. For Ukraine, this meant a fundamental transformation of economic and social life. The drive for industrialization focused on expanding heavy industry in cities like Dnipro, Kryvyi Rih, and Kharkiv. Massive state enterprises replaced private and cooperative ventures. Construction projects, including hydroelectric power stations on the Dnipro River and new industrial complexes in the Donbass region, became symbols of socialist progress. However, these projects relied on forced labor, strict quotas, and state coercion. In the countryside, collectivization began on a limited scale in 1929. The Soviet state sought to replace small independent farms with large collective farms, kolkhozy, and state farms, sovkhozy. This policy aimed to increase agricultural efficiency and secure grain supplies for urban industrial workers. In practice, it led to widespread resistance among Ukrainian peasants, who viewed collective farming as a return to serfdom. By 1930, the Communist Party declared private farming obsolete. Wealthier peasants, labeled kulaks, were targeted as class enemies. Thousands were arrested, deported, or executed. Grain requisition quotas rose sharply, and state control over agricultural production intensified. By the early 1930s, Ukraine was undergoing forced transformation on every level. The cultural freedoms of the 1920s gave way to ideological conformity. Writers, educators, and local officials who had once benefited from Ukrainization now faced accusations of bourgeois nationalism. Mykola Skrypynyk, one of the leading architects of the policy, was marginalized and later forced to recant his ideas. The shift marked the end of Ukraine's brief experiment with limited national autonomy within the Soviet system. As the first five-year plan progressed, economic targets outpaced reality, and rural discontent grew. These tensions would soon culminate in catastrophic consequences, most notably the famine of 1932 to 1933, known as the Holodomor. The decade between 1922 and 1932 thus represented a paradox. Ukraine experienced industrial and cultural development under the Soviet regime, but at the cost of political independence and personal freedom. The state built new institutions and infrastructure while laying the groundwork for one of the most devastating episodes in its modern history. By the beginning of 1932, Soviet Ukraine had entered one of the most destructive phases in its history. Joseph Stalin's program of forced collectivization, intended to convert private farms into collective enterprises, had met widespread resistance from Ukrainian peasants. Many refused to surrender their land, livestock, and tools. In response, the Soviet government imposed harsh requisition quotas for grain, far exceeding realistic yields. The system treated any shortfall as sabotage. The 1932 to 1933 famine, later known as the Holodomor, emerged from this combination of unrealistic state policies, grain confiscations, and punitive enforcement. In August 1932, the Soviet government passed the Law of 5 Years of Grain, which criminalized the collection of leftover grain from fields by starving peasants. Thousands were arrested or executed under this decree. Food was systematically seized from villages to meet export and urban supply quotas, leaving rural populations with nothing. Local communist officials, under pressure to meet targets, conducted raids known as Kornyi Doshki, black boards, during which entire villages were blacklisted for failing to meet quotas. These villages were cut off from trade and denied access to food. Internal passports, introduced in 1932, prevented peasants from leaving their districts to search for food in cities. By the spring of 1933, mass starvation had spread across Ukraine. Eyewitness accounts describe people dying in streets and fields, with entire villages depopulated. Families resorted to desperate measures for survival. Death rates peaked between April and June 1933. Estimates of the total number of victims range from 3.5 million to over 4 million in Soviet Ukraine alone, with millions more affected in the Kuban and North Caucasus regions, where many ethnic Ukrainians lived. While the Soviet government officially denied the existence of the famine, internal correspondence reveals that Stalin and his circle were aware of its scale. Rather than provide relief, the regime intensified its control. Grain exports continued through 1932, and Ukrainian political and cultural leaders were accused of nationalist deviation, suggesting that Moscow viewed the famine not just as an economic failure, but as a means to crush potential dissent. The famine coincided with a systematic campaign against the Ukrainian intelligentsia and communist leadership. Mykola Skrypynyk, a key figure in the earlier Ukrainization movement, was forced to publicly renounce his policies and committed suicide in July 1933. Thousands of teachers, writers, and scientists were dismissed, arrested, or executed on charges of promoting nationalism. The destruction of Ukraine's rural population and intellectual elite effectively ended the period of national revival that had characterized the 1920s. The famine also altered Ukraine's demographic composition. Villages were repopulated with settlers from Russia and Belarus, contributing to the policy of Russification. Following the Holodomor, Stalin's regime imposed tighter political and ideological control. The Communist Party of Ukraine was purged repeatedly. In 1934, the capital of Soviet Ukraine was moved from Kharkiv to Kyiv, a symbolic gesture indicating consolidation of authority in a city with deeper historical significance but closer surveillance from Moscow. The mid-1930s brought further repression during Stalin's Great Terror. Between 1936 and 1938, mass arrests and executions targeted perceived enemies of the state within the Communist Party, the military, and civilian society. In Ukraine, the purges were directed by the NKVD under officials like Vsevolod Balitsky. Local officials, intellectuals, and former revolutionaries were accused of belonging to counter-revolutionary organizations or collaborating with foreign powers. The cultural losses were immense. Virtually an entire generation of Ukrainian writers, artists, and scholars was eliminated. This group later became known as the Executed Renaissance, Rozstrzelanie Wydrodzenia. Figures such as Mykola Kulish, Les Kurbas, Valerian Podmohelny, and others were executed or sent to labor camps. The literary and artistic institutions of the 1920s were dismantled and replaced with organizations loyal to the official doctrine of socialist realism. The Orthodox Church, already weakened by the revolution and the 1920s anti-religious campaigns, faced renewed persecution. Thousands of churches were closed or destroyed, and clergy were arrested. Religious activity was driven underground. The Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, briefly revived during the earlier Ukrainization period, was liquidated in 1930. Economically, the first and second five-year plans, 1928 to 1937, achieved major industrial growth, particularly in heavy industries. New factories, power plants, and mines were built in the Donbass, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia regions. The Dnipro hydroelectric station, completed in 1932, became a showcase of Soviet modernization. Yet industrial expansion came at enormous human cost. Forced labor, poor living conditions, and unrealistic production demands. Agriculture, devastated by the famine, slowly recovered in the late 1930s but never regained pre-collectivization levels of productivity. The state continued to extract grain from collective farms, and private farming was outlawed. The peasantry, once the backbone of Ukrainian society, became the most tightly controlled segment of the population. By 1937, the political climate in Soviet Ukraine reached its most repressive stage. The NKVD carried out the so-called Polish operation and other national operations, targeting ethnic minorities along the western borderlands. Thousands of Poles, Germans, and others were executed or deported. The purges also struck the communist leadership itself. Between 1937 and 1938, nearly all members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine were arrested or killed. The 1937 Soviet census, which showed a population decline inconsistent with official growth targets, was suppressed, and those responsible for it were punished. The regime continued to deny the scale of demographic loss caused by famine and terror. By 1939, Soviet Ukraine had become a tightly controlled component of Stalin's centralized system. The Ukrainian language was still used in schools and administration, but the content of education and culture was heavily censored. Historical narratives were rewritten to emphasize the unity of Ukrainians and Russians under the elder brother model. At the same time, the USSR's foreign policy began to shift. Growing tensions in Europe, especially with Nazi Germany and Poland, created new strategic considerations for Moscow. Soviet propaganda emphasized the defense of socialism and peace, even as the regime prepared for further territorial expansion. The decade between 1932 and 1939 left Ukraine profoundly scarred. Collectivization, famine, and purges had destroyed millions of lives and eliminated the political, cultural, and intellectual structures that once defined Ukrainian distinctiveness. By the eve of World War II, the republic was industrialized and integrated into the Soviet Union, but stripped of independent political, religious, and cultural expression. By the mid-1980s, Ukraine remained one of the largest and most economically significant republics of the Soviet Union. Yet beneath the surface of apparent stability, discontent had been growing for decades. Industrial pollution, cultural suppression, and political stagnation were major issues. The policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, introduced after 1985, created space for reform and public discussion, inadvertently setting off forces that would end Soviet control. In Ukraine, glasnost allowed long-suppressed debates about the environment, language, and history to emerge. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster became a turning point. On April 26, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine exploded, releasing massive radioactive contamination across Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Europe. The Soviet government's delayed and secretive response caused widespread outrage. It revealed the inefficiency and dishonesty of the Soviet system and eroded public trust. For Ukrainians, Chernobyl symbolized Moscow's disregard for their lives and land. By 1988, cultural and historical revival movements began gaining momentum. Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, and environmentalists began to demand reforms. Organizations such as the Green World Environmental Group and the Memorial Society focused on uncovering historical injustices, especially Stalin-era repressions. The revival of the Ukrainian language and national identity became key issues. Newspapers began publishing long-suppressed material about the Holodomor and purges, exposing historical truths that had been denied for decades. In March 1989, Ukraine participated in the first relatively open elections to the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union. Although the Communist Party still dominated, several reform-minded and nationalist candidates gained seats. This marked the first breach in the Communist Party's monopoly on political life. Later that year, civic movements began organizing mass demonstrations. The most notable was the creation of the People's Movement of Ukraine, RUK, in 1989. Initially formed as a cultural organization, RUK quickly evolved into a political force advocating for democratic reforms, greater autonomy, and eventually independence. The collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe in 1989, beginning with Poland and East Germany, gave Ukrainians a clear view of political change as achievable. These events emboldened calls for sovereignty. The Ukrainian parliament, still largely composed of communists, began to assert the republic's rights within the Soviet framework. The Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR declared the republic's sovereignty on July 16, 1990. This declaration stated that Ukrainian laws took precedence over Soviet laws within its territory, a direct challenge to Moscow's authority. At the same time, social and political unrest grew. Strikes by miners in the Donbass region in 1989 and 1990 protested poor working conditions, low wages, and environmental degradation. These strikes, though economic in origin, carried political undertones. Miners demanded reforms and more local control. Across the republic, political clubs, civic associations, and independent newspapers multiplied. In March 1990, the first competitive elections to the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet were held. For the first time, non-communist candidates won significant representation. RUK and other pro-reform groups entered the legislature. The election also showed a growing regional divide. Western Ukraine strongly supported independence, while eastern regions remained more loyal to Moscow. Nevertheless, the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty gained broad appeal. Events in Moscow accelerated the process. In August 1991, hardline Soviet officials launched a coup attempt to overthrow Gorbachev and restore strict communist control. The coup failed after 3 days, but it destroyed the legitimacy of the Communist Party. In Kyiv, the Ukrainian leadership reacted swiftly. On August 24, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine adopted the Act of Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, proclaiming Ukraine an independent democratic state. This declaration cited the coup as evidence of the USSR's instability and the need for Ukraine to control its own destiny. Following the declaration, the parliament scheduled a national referendum to confirm the decision. On December 1, 1991, Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly in favor of independence. Over 90% supported it, with a majority in every region, including Crimea. That same day, Leonid Kravchuk, former Communist Party leader of Ukraine, was elected as the country's first president. Within days, the Soviet Union's collapse became inevitable. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus met in the Belovez forest in Belarus. They signed the Belovez Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS, as a loose successor organization. By the end of December 1991, the red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin, marking the end of the USSR. Ukraine emerged as an independent state for the first time in the modern era. A combination of internal reforms, the failures of Soviet governance, and the mobilization of Ukrainian society had driven the process. The years between 1985 and 1991 transformed Ukraine from a Soviet republic under strict control into a sovereign nation determined to define its own path. The structures of the old system remained, but the idea of Ukrainian independence, rooted in centuries of struggle, revival, and resistance, had finally become a reality.